Now, we are going to turn the clock back now to an era when the radio landscape looked very different from the one many of us enjoy today. Mention the word pirate just now and our minds inevitably turn to the violent activities of criminals off the coast of Somalia. But back in the 1960s, there was another type of pirate.
This is Radio Caroline on 199, your all-day music station. We are on the air every day from 6 in the morning to 6 at night. The time right now is 1 minute past 12, and that means it's time for Christopher Moore.
Well, Radio Caroline is perhaps the best known of the pirate radio stations of that era. It started back in 1964 when British radio was dominated by the BBC.
Hello and happy Easter to all of you. This is Christopher Moore with the first record program on Radio Caroline. The first record is by the Rolling Stones, and I'd like to play it for all of the people who worked to put the station on the air, and particularly for Ronan.
Well, back in those days, there were no commercial stations and very little popular music was being played. Radio Caroline broke all the rules and, in fact, broke broadcasting laws by playing the music people wanted to hear all around the clock. At one time, the DJs claimed to have 25 million listeners. Not surprisingly, though, it didn't go down very well with the authorities. Here's the Postmaster General Edward Short speaking in 1966.
The pirate stations pinch these wavelengths. They're a hazard to shipping. And thirdly, of course, they're acting illegally, and we live under the rule of law in this country. And if these wealthy interests who run these ships can cock a snook at the law, this brings the law into disrepute.
Well, now, 46 years after they started, a new book says the spirit of pirate radio is still very much alive and well. Adrian Johns is a professor of history at the University of Chicago. His book, Death of a Pirate, argues that there's still a little bit of the pirate spirit in today's radio landscape, and that the pirates of the 60s have even influenced the podcasters of today.
Radio was a vehicle for popular experimentation right from the beginning. And the communities that evolved to experiment with radio, not only in the UK but in the United States, France and Germany, had a very strong belief that the way to advance radio in particular, but technology and culture more generally, was through the open sharing of research and information. And that ethos is one that was inherited by the digital communities now. The ideals of distributed creativity and shared information that pervade the world of digital networks are ideals that date back to the pirate experimenters who challenged the monopoly on media that existed in the mid-20th century.
So were they really trailblazers? Well, who better to ask than a pirate? John Myers was a DJ on Radio Caroline in 1986-87, broadcasting from a ship off the coast of England. He went on to broadcast on French pirate radio and was even raided by the police at one stage.
Yes, that was probably the high point of my career. I was just queuing up the next record. We were aware that we might have been broadcasting on the edge of the law. We thought we had a licence, but we'd had to change frequency a few times. And it wasn't a complete surprise when not 1, 2, 3, but 8 gendarmes walked into the studio. And the chief policeman had a scroll which he unravelled to inform us that by the orders of the Ministry of the Interior we were being taken off the air, and you sort of quietly pull the fader down and say, anything else I can do to help you, officer, in your best French.
Yes, when eight gendarmes come in, you know they mean business.
They hadn't come in for a request or a dedication.
Now, you and I are colleagues. I never knew you had this revolutionary side to you.
I loved radio, and I'm sure you did, Julian, and we found as young kids back in the early 1980s, there was a sort of community spirit of people pre-recording programmes almost in their bedrooms and playing them from the tops of London tower blocks, and it was so cheap, that was the point. Any enthusiast could get a 100-watt FM transmitter for around $150 back in the early 80s, and you would be able to cover the whole of London. So you could play your music, you could do your style of radio, you could create something that simply wasn't available elsewhere.
But the fact that it was breaking the law, did that trouble you at all?
It didn't specifically cross our minds because we were young and naive, I guess, and the fact was that it seemed to be tolerated. The key rule was don't interfere with another licensed service. If you were causing a problem, you could expect problems. And we were at the beginning of something that became actually quite a big commercial industry that followed on from us. We had live all-day dance music stations broadcasting in stereo, and that's when the authorities really woke up to the situation and thought, we've either got to clamp down and or legislate and create new stations. So basically, if you showed there was a demand for a service, it was up to the government to respond and say, well, OK, let's give London a dance music station. OK, well, we'll hear the thoughts of Diane and Paddy on this in a moment, but at this point in the conversation, we are going to hear a piece of music that I know, John, there is a story behind. So we'll hear the story after we've heard the music. These are the Waterboys and The Whole of the Moon.
I pictured a rainbow. You held it in your hands.
And the story was?
Picture a big red boat about 40 kilometres off the English coastline, about 90 metres long with an aerial mast 90 metres high. And the problem with pirate radio is you get very sucked into the cause. You do anything to keep the station on air, and I was one of the few loonies that was actually willing to climb the aerial mast to carry out essential repairs. When you get to about 60 metres up and you're attached to the mast by a chain round your waist and you can't quite reach a loose cable, and in the end you let go of the mast, balancing on a cross tree to grab hold of that cable and pull it back in. And you look down at your knees, and it's the only time in my life where I've known the pure knee trembler, that sort of fear and adrenaline mixed together. They're just the kind of things you do to keep the station on air. And when you've got a glorious full moon looking out over the Thames estuary, a song like this sort of sums up your time of working on a boat in the North Sea. I'm
sitting and looking at Diane's facial expression. I can't determine whether you're thrilled, aghast, or just generally absorbed by John's story.
Well, I'm very happy, and thank you. Something light-hearted, some music for a cold morning after we've been talking about nuclear weapons and death and all that. Fantastic. And I thought, what you talked about when you were young, that part that is against the law didn't exactly cross your mind. I don't want to get into any trouble. I was in Tiananmen Square, and as a youth, in a way, it's not the same thing, but it's part of that thrill. Being young, you think actually it's your duty to go up against the establishment, something unfair of the world, and to make changes to the world, make it better. Was that something that you felt?
Yeah, I think that is the whole point about radio, isn't it? That it's used for so many different means. We communicate very important information, but we also provide entertainment. We play music. We give people hope. We give people spirit. Even François Mitterrand, the former president of France, was convicted for pirate radio and promised if he was re-elected that he would liberalise radio in France and give everyone the chance to go on air and play their music and do their thing.
Paddy Coulter, were you a Radio Caroline or a pirate radio listener?
Yeah, I'm grinning here from ear to ear because I'm growing up in Northern Ireland and I'm listening to the Beatles for the very first time. I don't think we called it pirate radio. We weren't clear whether it was legal or illegal, but it had that, as Dan said, that sort of buzz of being not quite authorised. What I find amazing, though, is that radio, which is a very old media, I mean, it dates back 100 years and the arrival of first programs on radio in the 1920s, and yet here we are in the 21st century when you've got the digital media which is supposed to replace this stuff, but in fact what it does is just gives it a new lease of life with podcasts.
Well, let me examine that for a moment, because that's sort of where we began this conversation, this theory that the spirit of those times is influencing the podcasters of today. John Myers, do you think that professor has a point?
I certainly think so, because if you've got a certain style of music that you feel isn't being played elsewhere, you can create your own little show, you can advertise it through networking sites, people can discover it. If there's a style of radio, sort of, for instance, comedy, that you might feel is lacking, a certain edgy or aggressive style of broadcasting that you want to create, you can do that podcast. The only thing that's missing is the live element. And I do think listeners like that idea that we're listening to some naughty guys breaking the law here. They're possibly risking life and limb on a boat, or they're climbing around on the top of a London tower block not to put their transmitter up and hope they don't get raided before the programme's completed. I think people like that risky element of the live broadcast.
I just wonder with the theory whether or not the landscape of radio has changed so much in the 40 plus years we're talking about, that there is now so much choice out there that it's very hard to see any gaps left in the market.
I think that's a fair point. It's interesting if you tune along the FM dial in London, though, that you will still find on any given day 10 or 15 pirate radio stations, despite the government's attempts to legislate for absolutely every taste. There's always one niche out there that someone feels hasn't been filled.
John Myers reviving a few radio memories.